Hi, we're happy to be back at Manhattan Neighborhood Network show on Feminist Global Advocacy. I'm Radhika Balakrishnan from Rutgers University and the Center for Women's Global Leadership, also at Rutgers University. I'm going to have our panel introduce themselves. So Ejim, if you could start.
I'm Ejim Dike with the U.S. Human Rights Network.
I'm Sanam Naraghi-Anderlini, the co-founder of the International Civil Society Action Network, ICAN, spearheading the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership globally.
And I'm Andrea Arroyo, visual artist, cultural advocate, and curator of Tribute to the Disappeared.
Thank you. So we were here last month, and at the end of our show last month, we each took a minute to tell the presidential candidates what were the issues that we wanted them to think about. So this time, our show is dedicated to an entire hour of what we would like the presidential candidates to think about. So we're going to start with a few themes that we're going to discuss. And the first theme is on whose lives matter. In this run-up to the presidential elections in the United States, there are many people talking about people's lives. And we want to address those issues in terms of the kind of issues we all work on. And in terms of whose lives matter, there's domestic politics, there's international cross-border politics, who's valued, who gets a say in terms of the lives that are considered in international policy making. So to start our discussion, I'm going to Ejim Dike, and who works a lot in the United States, the U.S. Human Rights Network. And in terms of the issues you're dealing with, Ejim, how would you address this issue, and what would you want the presidential candidates to talk about, and what are the ways in which you want them to frame it?
Well, thank you. So let's see. So in theory, of course, all lives matter, right? But I think there's a reason why people around the world, and particularly in the United States, have resonated with the term Black Lives Matter. Because in fact, it turns out to be the case, not just in the United States, but all over the world, that how much society values your life has a lot to do, or correlates, I should say, with the color of your skin. And the closer you are to a dark sub-Saharan African, the less value your life seems to have in society. In the U.S., I mean, we see it play out in some really practical ways. The majority, almost 80% of people who are on death penalty, who have been executed, were executed for killing white victims. Meanwhile, 50% of victims who are Black. So it's I think that's a really good example, indicating that as a society, our systems in particular, our media, our public systems tend to publicly value certain lives over others. But I want to say also that in some ways, like valuing or devaluing Black lives so overtly is really a way to bamboozle us all, because the truth is our systems don't actually value any population that doesn't have social power, political power, economic power, or they tend not to value them. And we see that in the US, this is the richest country in the world, and yet we have the highest child poverty rate of any wealthy nation. And so, you know, we could go on about this forever, but I'll say that even within, and I'm sure Andrea and Sanam will talk about this, but even within populations that tend to be devalued in society, you'll find that people who are more marginalized, like women, people who are transgender, undocumented immigrants, people with disabilities, tend not to even be part of the conversation.
Absolutely. So Sanam, President Obama just went to Saudi Arabia. There's so much going on in the Middle East and North Africa. It's in the news in Europe and the United States. Refugee crisis, war in Yemen. So in this concept of whose lives matter, I think there's a lot to be spoken about in terms of international politics. I wonder what you could say to to that question.
I think just to hone in on this question in terms of the starkness of the issues. So, here we talk about wanting to stop the war in Syria. We talk about refugees, and by the way, refugees is a way of really taking away the humanity of people, right? It's men, women, boys, girls, teachers, doctors, dancers, artists. These are, people like us who have been caught up in this craziness, and then as they flood out, their identity is slowly stripped out of them, and they're boxed together essentially as if they're criminals and terrorists, which is just awful. So that there's that aspect of how we devalue and diminish people's lives as well, in terms of how we take away, that we strip their identities. But one of the things that, given the visit to Saudi Arabia, is that over the last year, it's just been over a year now, since March of last year, Saudi Arabia, for reasons that are kind of complicated, but at some on some level quite simple, started a bombing campaign against Yemen. Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world, right? And it's been systematic, it's been ongoing, and we, the United States, have backed it 100% from the beginning. It's called a coalition, but it's basically Arab states led by Saudi Arabia with backing and support, weapons and so forth from the US and UK and France, dropping bombs on Yemeni children, right? Why? Do we, why is it that we don't talk about it? Why is it that there's not much more kind of debate around this? What's the purpose? Why do we let that happen? So clearly, those lives don't matter. We see this every once in a while when Gaza is attacked, the Gaza Strip is attacked. That if it's Palestinian lives, the proportionality of how many Palestinians have to die versus an Israeli. Last week, there was a protest in Tel Aviv. Thousands of people showed up, and they had posters saying "Kill all Arabs." If this was the other way around, if it was kill, I don't know, all. I mean, it's inconceivable to think about who would put up a poster like that about anybody else, and it wouldn't cause outrage. But if it's but it's become okay. And the saddest or the most tragic piece of all of this also is that not only these communities, these societies are being attacked by outside and by proxy wars, their own governments also. So in Egypt, we're seeing 500-600 people have been disappeared for simply speaking out. And we are an ally of Egypt. We, as the United States, with our tax dollars, are supporting their military and so forth. And yet, at what point does this issue come into the discussions? In Turkey, right now, people are in jail. So it's a question of who's paying the ultimate price for the purposes of some geopolitical relationships which really have reached the end of their tether in a way.
Yeah. Andrea, in terms of the work that you do, in terms of people who are being disappeared, if you could take a stab at that question. And one of the things I also want us to keep in mind is that also think about what is it that, you've done this already, but what is it that you want the presidential candidates to really think about when they're thinking about these issues?
Well, speaking of the disappeared, speaking about Mexico, since the so-called war on drugs, we have 26,000 people disappeared. And people don't disappear, they're kidnapped, they're abducted, they're taken, they don't disappear, it's not magic. Yeah. So it's 26,000 disappeared, over 100,000 people murdered. And it keeps going on. It goes on every day. We have a government that has placed no value on the life of anyone who has no power. And in terms of most developing countries, it's people of color, poor people, of course. And the numbers are just incredible. The numbers are just heartbreaking, and it doesn't just happen. I want to talk about responsibility, like who's responsible, and what can we do? Because sometimes what happens is that these numbers are so shocking that people get so shocked into not doing anything. So I want to talk about what we can do, like personal responsibility, what we all can do.
Okay, great. Let me talk a little bit about the issues that I think we need to consider when in terms of whose lives matter. And I want to show a graph, actually the other graph, to talk a little bit about levels of inequality in work. Could we change the graph? Thank you. So what you see in the top is the income, the real wage increases of people in the top percent. And you could see the top 10%, the increase in income is staggering. It keeps going up from 1979 to 2014. And what you see at the bottom are the incomes of the middle and poor class. And real wages have been stagnant for 30 years. And the place it's going is to the rich. So it's not as though that the money that's made by the rich are not coming from the backs of the people who are poor. And so in terms of whose lives matters, I mean, one of the things that this presidential elections really highlighted is the issue of inequality. And in some ways the focus has been on the rich and the problems of having incredible concentrations of wealth at the top. But we also need to talk about why is it that real wages have been stagnant for this long for people. And if you look at worker productivity over time, worker productivity has actually gone up and wages have stayed down. So if you have productivity going up and wages going down, there's really no way for working people who work full-time jobs and work really hard to make a living. The other part of whose life matters in terms of the inequality, and I think this is really important and something that I don't think is talked about enough. I mean, there's some conversation on banks being too big, but the reason for this level of unprecedented inequality is really the changes in financial regulation. And so if you look at the next graph, what we see is an absolute correlation between the changes in the regulatory framework on finance and increases in inequality. So, you look at those two graphs and what you see is that there is a direct relationship between regulation of finance and increases in inequality. And that seems a very basic idea that there's a reason for this level of inequality. It isn't only because people work harder at the top 1%. It's that the role of government has changed in terms of regulating finance. And I think it's one of the most critical issues of our time. And that changes in regulation have affected poor people. It has a race and class and gender dimension in terms of the subprime mortgage. Black women were 350 times more likely to get a subprime mortgage than a white man. And so they're not just sort of abstract concepts, but concepts in the real lives of human beings. And I think when we talk about inequality, we need to talk about what are the reasons for wage stagnation, and really important is the financialization of our economy and the need to really re-regulate our finance sector that's making us all, our entire economy is not working. And I think it might be working for that 0.01%, but even for them at some point, the level of inequality is going to decrease growth in the entire economy. So I think the issue of whose lives matter is that unless we start talking about real policy solutions to increasing wages of the poor and middle class, and the poor, many people talk about the middle class, but I think we really need to focus on the poor and the working poor who work many jobs and are still below the poverty line.
Maybe that would be a good time to show the faces of some of the, if we can have the first picture, yes. So when we're talking about the disappearances in the sense of injustice and invisibility, we can see here a photograph of 5 of the mothers of the 43 students that were disappeared from the Ayotzinapa Teachers College in Mexico. And that happened September 26, 2014. So it's 19 months ago. So it's not just numbers, it's people. Like every one of these kids that was kidnapped by the police they all have families, and those families are living in the Ayotzinapa Teachers College in sort of a refugee camp situation in a place in a country that's supposed to be at peace. So it's not only about the numbers, it's about the people, and that we have to connect with the humanity of every living being. Every human being has this, we all have the same value. We have to value each other's lives equally. So that's one of the reasons I like to put faces to the numbers as well.
Absolutely. I was just in Mexico last week, and some of the mothers were in Mexico City trying to bring attention to the lives of their children, and so it continues as an ongoing struggle for the people that are there and whose real live children are missing.
Radhika, I do want to respond more directly to that question about what we think the candidates should be talking about as it relates to lives mattering. One thing we just mentioned, and Andrea talked about it, was basically, I think Sanam, you talked about it too, is not hiding behind terms, right? So we talk about the disappeared, you mentioned refugees, even criminals, terrorists. In the US, they use the term thugs, but they're all in some ways of losing or of disappearing our humanity and being able to do some of the most horrendous, heartbreaking things to groups of people or deny them their basic rights because they're hidden behind this group, right? And I think the presidential candidates have a platform. So one of the things I've really enjoyed about this election in the US is how competitive the Democratic primary has been, at least. And it's allowed them to raise issues that they typically wouldn't have raised before. I think they have a platform and that they can be talking more about the human beings and trying to force a narrative change when it comes to these terms. The other thing I did want to mention also has to do with police accountability. Because when we talk, it is true that the candidates now all say Black Lives Matter, but they don't really say what that means.
Exactly.
And so I think one of the things that means is accountability and police accountability. Last year alone, police killed over 1,000. I want to say 1,042, but over 1,000 people. Do you know how many were actually charged? I don't mean found guilty, charged. 17.
Wow.
So, I mean, when you live in this kind of culture of impunity, and by the way, not all those 1,000 were Black people. They're all people of all hues. But when you have a culture that refuses to hold police accountable, that is something our candidates should be talking about.
Absolutely.
Just on the labels question, another way that I think they make these distinctions is by saying, for example, Muslim women, versus women, it's or even the concept of women's rights, right? Last I looked, we were human beings, right? So I understand why we talk about women's rights, but the idea that it's sort of, that it's women and then the rest of humanity, that this kind of this issue of constantly trying to divide as opposed to show the universality, I think is really important. And then the other point that you're making around, where's the accountability? So we say Black Lives Matter, but then, why aren't we looking at the role of the police? It's the same with violence against women. It's violence against women is kind of presented as if it's a women's issue. It's not. No. By and large, it is women being affected by it, right. in the majority of cases, it's not women perpetrating it. There are women who perpetrate violence against other women, there's no doubt, right? But this is an issue about men's, propensity for, or percentage of the population of men who have a propensity for violence.
Yes.
Why isn't it framed that way as opposed to
Absolutely.
framed as if it's our issue, right?
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I want to continue this conversation on whose lives matter, and we've each talked about issues in Mexico and the United States, and you, Sanam, entire region of the world. But I would like us to think about also whose lives matter when we cross borders. And what are the issues of immigration? Because that's another big issue that's on the presidential debates, with building walls on one side, with allowing immigrants to stay in this country legally. Anyway, not to get into the complexities of the immigration debate, but I think immigration and people living in countries that they weren't born in or whose parents weren't born in is a big part of the issue that this presidential election is dealing with. And so, Ejim, I want to start with you. And in terms of the groups that you work with, what are the kind of issues that you feel are being highlighted by the activists on the ground?
Yeah. I mean, one of the issues being highlighted is actually that this administration, sadly, has deported more people than any of its predecessors. And they're also looking at the issue. So a lot of people, you've heard of the Not One More campaign, but are calling for a moratorium on deportations. And this dates back to the Clinton era. But people are now deported for basically committing really low-level offenses. In some cases, people are being deported. They had a DUI, they served their time here, and then they're sent back. So deportation is obviously a huge issue. Detention, particularly the notion of family detention, putting families in prison, including, and I say prison because it's called detention, but really they're prison-like conditions. And whenever we've talked to people who've been detained, they say they felt like they were in prison.
Yeah. Well,
They were in jail.
I don't have freedom to go out.
No, you don't have to, and the way they're treated in there. Some people are forced to work for a whole day for $1. It's like, it's ridiculous. We had a woman who talked about how she was put in detention for working without papers and then forced to work in detention. So, that's another issue. But I think the overarching issue was the issue of being undocumented and being forced into the shadows, and how that makes you vulnerable in so many ways. It makes you vulnerable as a worker. It makes you vulnerable as a woman. It makes you vulnerable in terms of the police calling for security in so many different aspects. And so that's a big concern. I did want to say this real quick. Family detention, people are calling for the shutdown and for family detention not to even exist at all. So there are a myriad of issues, and we'll talk more about them. But
Andrea, you want to talk about?
Yes. Yes. So basically, people don't cross the border risking their lives for no reason.
exactly.
Right? Like, why do they come? Like, why do so many hundreds or thousands of people cross borders across the world? And that's because it's survival. It's not for adventure. It's not for greed. It's just mere survival. So, the risking of life is real. Just in the border of Arizona, just in that section of the border in Arizona with Mexico, there are around 200 people dying every year just crossing the border, right? And those, there are around 200 people bodies found every year, right? And then you have the people who are detained, you have the people who are deported, and also the issue of detention centers that are privatized. So it's a huge business. I think issues sometimes are all intermingled, but always, corporations and big businesses are a big part of the equation. And immigrants come here and they contribute huge amounts of money to the economy. They contribute hugely to the cultural life and the fabric of the country. Immigrants are doers. They are sometimes miracle workers because they are used to making something out of nothing, right? And they are resourceful, and they are here for a reason, and they're not going to waste their time, basically, right? So they come here and they get a job in a place that's supposed to be, the economy is supposed to be in shambles. They do get a job, I don't know how. And they manage to support their families back in their countries. They support themselves here. They pay taxes that they're never going to see back, because most of them are going to either go back or they're undocumented, so they're not going to really see their money back. So it's basically, I think we have to look at immigration and as to immigrants as human beings. They're not just numbers. They're not the enemy. They're coming here for a reason, and it has to do with international economy. It has to do with trade agreements. It has to do with corporations. So it's not just individuals that just get in their minds, I like the U.S., I'm going to go to New York.
Yeah.
It's a reason. And if I can see now the image I have an image of a flag that an artist made. And it's an image of, it evokes the American flag, but it's really the fence between the U.S. and Mexico. And you see a couple of immigrants trying to cross and get over the fence. So it's just, an image of what people see. People see the U.S. as the richest country in the world, which it is. And it's very interesting to me that the richest country in the world is so afraid of everyone else. Mm-hmm. It's so afraid of poor people coming in and taking over. So many times I ask myself, who are we really protecting? Like, who are we thinking of?
Well, and also the other thing to remember is that the people that were in the United States are not the ones running this country. We're all immigrants. If you think about, the role of the Native American in this country is made up of immigrants, and so it's about which immigrants are allowed and which ones are not. And there's been a lot of work on European immigration, and recently, especially with the images of the Syrian refugees, they've also been images of European immigrants trying to come to the United States. Yeah. When Europe was poor, and so there seems to be a rewriting of history as to how people move, and why people move, and when you're allowed to move, and then when that history is rewritten as though this country was always white. That itself is kind of a problem. Yeah. And then I wanted to kind of piggyback on what you said, Andrea, is that the trade agreements are a big part of it. I don't have a chart of that today, but if you look at the increase in immigration from Mexico to the United States in particular, there's just a huge escalation after 1994, which is when NAFTA was signed. And so the impact on agriculture in Mexico was huge with the flooding of cheap products from the United States. And so farmers there could not make a living, and therefore were crossing borders. So if we look at immigration in isolation to the structural issues that cause migration, we're missing the boat. And that's the one thing I feel like is really missing in the presidential discussion is, why do people migrate? And also, as an immigrant myself, I didn't climb over a border. I was welcomed here, right. And so but it was a particular time. It was 1971, not now. I wouldn't be welcome now. And so I think we need to talk about, how if you have $1 million, you can come here. And the last thing I want to say, and I'm going to go to Sanam in terms of sort of a global perspective, is that, immigrants who come here not only work hard, but they're incredible organizers, and so it's the immigrant workers that really organize, for example, the increase in prices of tomato pickers in the United States that impacted all farmers and farm workers. And so it's not only that they come and work, but they also organize, they contribute to the lives of everyone who's in this country. So I think that, we need to complicate the issues around immigration, and also look at the many different kind of contributions immigrants make to this country.
Before we go to the global, I just also want to say, we also, in complicating the narrative, we also need to talk about the immigrants who are not the best of people, because all immigrants are deserving of human rights. And I think that, we have to be mindful that, in fact, we're not saying that, so it's important for our viewers to know, so we're not saying that only hardworking immigrants should be treated a certain way. Yes, immigrants are hardworking, but even if a particular person was not, you have your human rights and you have a basic right to migration. And the reason I think that's important is that a lot of the people working on immigration reform have used that as an excuse to essentially create loopholes for people who have committed offenses.
Yeah.
And that's created a bit of a problem in terms of making sure that everybody is fighting together.
So Sanam, I'm going to have you talk about immigration in terms of, but not just in terms of immigration, but sort of the discussions that are taking place in Europe on who's an immigrant, who's a refugee, when do you get to cross borders, especially given the colonial history that Europe has with all these countries.
So I sort of divided up into two broad categories. So I think you have economic migrants, people who are looking for better jobs. And frankly speaking, Europe has very nicely exploited that, right? So in England, if you look, certainly when I had my children 15 years ago, the nursing staff at the hospital, which is a national hospital, was predominantly immigrant workers who, by the way, had been trained in their own countries. So their own countries had invested in their education, right?
Exactly.
Made them registered nurses, but they got paid less in Malawi or wherever it was that they were coming from, and they come to the UK. And then in the UK, they get paid less than a British nurse would, right? So it's cheap labor that we're using, and we haven't invested in them at all. Somebody else invested, and we're taking that. If in the past colonialism was going in and taking the natural resources that were there, now it's taking the human resources and the social capital, right? So that's one aspect, and that goes back, in the 50s across the different countries. So you have economic migrants, and you have that within Europe now. I mean, as your European Union enlarged, you have Eastern Europeans coming into Western Europe and doing a lot of the service sector work as well, right? But the problem right now that they're worried about, obviously, is this flow of political refugees. Migrants, refugees, but it's people who are fleeing their countries because of war, because of insecurity, and so forth. And I relate to that because we at some point left. I was a child when we left, and it was nowhere near as horrendous as what we're seeing in Syria. But people get scared and they move, and you don't actually plan to migrate. You're seeking safe haven for a short period of time to then go back home.
Exactly.
Right? And the problem is that now displacement has, instead of being a short-term thing, it's become a long-term thing because we're not investing in either preventing those conflicts or trying to address the political issues with greater detail and sustainability, or helping to end the wars. Right, so the amount of money that we put into carrying on the Syrian civil war versus how much effort we put into bringing everybody together to actually say, okay, we need a peace, and just the sheer effort of negotiations and dialogue and so forth. It's a huge imbalance. So that's one thing. And then the other part of the conversation is that there is tremendous inhumanity in the conversations that we have here versus how the region itself is coping. The United States has registered 3,095 Syrians to be resettled here, right? 3,095 Syrians for a population of 323 million people. Okay, it doesn't, if you wanted to do it as a percentage, there's so many zeros, it's an insignificant number. Now compare that to Lebanon, which has itself a population of 4.5 million people, and they have registered, or an estimated arrival rate, and many people just flow into society and live very quiet lives. But the estimated arrival rate of 1.5 million people, and it's probably more than that, right? So they've had a 30% increase in their population because of refugees, right? And there are all sorts of issues, there are all sorts of tensions, but it's they're absorbing them.
Yeah.
You know, Turkey, Jordan has a population of 7.7 million people. They have, an estimated arrival rate of 1.26 million. So that's like 15% of the population, right, of their own population that's going in, and they're somehow taking them on. And here it's the narrative of fear, and there are 3,000 people that have come. And as I say, one can imagine that the vast majority of people, if they felt that there was peace in Syria, that they could go home and it could be safe to rebuild, they would be going home to rebuild, right?
Yes.
So it's an indictment of our own sense of who we are as a country that claims to have the Statue of Liberty and things that we're not that human or humane, I should say. You know.
No, and I think, and it goes back to the initial question as to whose lives matter. You know, I mean, just the term refugee, you know, it dehumanizes the person. It's like the Syrian refugee, and as you said, they're human beings. You know, they're doctors, they're workers, they're mothers, they're grandfathers, and why are they getting on a boat? And you know, what was it? Just 2 days ago, 500 people died on a boat. Why would you do that? Because where they're coming from is so much worse, and it is so much worse because of our foreign policy. You know,
We're part. I mean, the problems we are
we're-
a component of the
we're a
problem. We're not.
component.
It's not all our, but we certainly
Absolutely.
played an important role.
And so, but I'm just saying
Creating the
that
conditions.
we talk about the refugee without connecting it to
Absolutely.
foreign policy. I'm not saying
That's
it's our
right.
fault,
Yeah.
but but if you don't talk about both of those in conjunction with each other as to, you know, what are the issues that you need to deal with, the refugee crisis isn't whether we like bring 3,000 people over, but it really is how do we internationally bring the community together and take leadership to stop the bombing of this country. I mean, I've seen videos. It is devastating what's happening there. I mean, there in Yemen and all these other places that create these refugees. So I think we need to talk about the, you know, immigration, but it's kind of like with trade and foreign policy. I mean, we need to complicate these issues, and I wish that the presidential candidates, or at least their speechwriters, would make issues a little bit more complicated than the little sound bites and blaming people for this. And this, I think this discussion that we're having right now really segues into the second set of issues that we wanted to talk about, which is the kind of highlighting of the issue of security and how security has become the reason for wanting to build walls around countries, security for the militarization of our world, and both in terms of domestic policy. If you look at the military in Ferguson, you know, the use of military equipment by the police, the use of militarism as the answer to any kind of issues of conflict in the world, rather than other kinds of resolutions, and also, you know, with the issues of militarism, what kind of masculinity is that bringing up? You know, and what kind of role model do we have in terms of answers to conflict that people have? I mean, people are going to have had conflicts from ever and will, but what are the solutions to it? It seems like our candidates and I think our powers that be have become sort of complicit in just assuming that militarism is the answer. So I want us to now shift to sort of talking about security and really think about what does security mean to us? If we say the word security, I mean, do we think about someone in a machine gun coming in, or is there something else that we want to address in terms of security? And in terms of security, I think I'll start actually with Sanam and talk about the military and security and what that is doing in terms of women and peace and security, and how do we interject the feminist voice into that the dialogue, which I know you've been working on for a very long time and have a lot of experience in doing that.
So just to start off with, as a Pakistani colleague of mine said recently, she said 15 years of counter-terrorism strategy has not done any good, and it's made things a lot worse, right? And my analogy when I think about it in terms of kind of how one explains it in the most simplified ways, it's a little bit like Dr. Seuss's The Cat in the Hat comes back. The Cat in the Hat comes back, there's a mess, he tries to clean it up and it makes bigger and bigger and bigger and it just gets worse and worse and worse.
Absolutely.
That's basically the militarized approach that we've had since 9/11, predominantly. That's the world we're in right now. And what happens is that not only is it about budgets and money and vast quantities that are directed towards security and defense without us really knowing what it is and why, how much of it is defunct from the Cold War and how much of it is actually relevant to contemporary conditions and so forth. And that means that it's not money that goes either for humanitarian assistance or for the ground kind of foundational work of peace building and education and economic development and all those other things that people want so that they can actually have the resilience to not have conflict and war and good governance issues, right? I mean, we have helped, the United States, we have supported dictators around many parts of the world, from Latin America to the Middle East. And when you support dictators and they quash moderate dissent, human rights organizations and activists, that dissent becomes radical. It just, dissent goes underground because it's injustice. There's all sorts of grievances. And then it comes back at you in different ways, right? So the notion that we support big men with big arms, and that's going to give us security is a complete fallacy, right? And yet that's the paradigm that we're in. And what's happening is that there's a very clever use of words sometimes in terms of the techno-wizardry being a way of keeping us out of these discussions. They try and make it complex, they try and use fancy terms. It's all very technical, but scratch the surface, and it's about lives. It really is about basic lives. Or they try and make it cool, right? So a few years ago, the term kinetic operations became kind of standard parlance in Washington circles when the military was present. Now, kinetic and potential, the last time I heard those two terms was in physics class, right? Exactly. And it's about potential energy and then kinetic energy. Well, guess what? Kinetic operations are basically when we start bombing people and when sort of attacks are being planned, it's kinetic, right? So it's terminology that sounds kind of fancy, right? But they use that, and then you see the civilian population, like the civil society work, the community beginning to use the same words. But this is like in the world of economics talking about downsizing, right? Which is basically getting rid of people, but it's it's negative growth. I mean, I've never understood. It's like either it's growth or it's not. What is negative growth? It's sort of so these strange ways that they use words is kind of a way of keeping us away from the fundamental conversations, and it's become very depressing because actually I would say, despite all the work that we've done around bringing women's voices to the peace table, wanting not only just women's voices, but women who have a peace agenda, and women who have the range from the various hues of color and regions to the table, because they bring different perspectives and because they bring a human security perspective rather than this militarized security. Yeah. Despite all of this work, since 9/11, we've been facing a tsunami, and the militarized security approach has infiltrated every sector. Yeah. And I'll just end with one story last week where the head of one of the major refugee organizations, non-state refugee organizations, and charity organizations, was speaking in Washington about the issue of education of Syrian children. And very compassionate, very, very nice speech. And at the end of it, I asked him, all these issues you're talking about, don't you think we should be skimming the military budget, the 1.6 trillion that the top 50 countries in the world are spending, and most of it is by the United States, to go towards not only humanitarian but development and education, building schools. $180 million goes a long way in building schools for refugees. And he actually turned around and he said, well, we need. He said Frederick the Great said, diplomacy without arms is like something like empty talk, and we need military interventions to enable humanitarian access. That's depressing for me, because this is somebody who should be asking for, as I say, even just a skimming of our military budgets to go towards development and humanitarian work, and yet one has to assume, okay, maybe this person has political ambitions, they don't want to rock the boat with the defense and military sector. whatever it is, it's becoming we've been infiltrated in so many ways we don't even realize it anymore.
Yeah. Andrea, what do you think about the issue of security and how it needs to be spoken about and
Yeah.
how it's being spoken about now?
I always, I ask myself when we're talking about national security, who are we protecting?
Yeah.
Really, are we protecting people or are we protecting private property? Because national security sounds good on paper. Like, sure, everybody wants to be secured, but are we protecting? What are we protecting? The American way of life that actually relies on the exploitation of a lot of people and peoples. So I don't know. Corporations cross borders, capitals cross borders, and then when we're talking about human beings, then people say we need to build a wall, right? So capitals can cross and corporations can cross, and then human beings, they're like, oh no, that's not good. And when we're talking about building a wall in the richest country in the world, in the most powerful country in the world, is how civilized is that? I mean, that's just taking us back to the dark ages, right? Just building a wall. Like, what are you doing that you have to protect yourself so much? It's just frightening. So for me, who is the enemy? Like, really, we have to figure out who the enemy is. And if we're not making friends, like, we're going to find a lot of people that seem like the enemy, because if we're unfriendly, it's kind of difficult to get along in human terms. And, in other ways, security has to do also with individuals, like, people feel insecure. Like, why do they flee their countries? Why do they leave their homes and their farms and their jobs and their whole lives for, to risk everything to go somewhere else? Yeah. And in terms of Mexico and the U.S., well, security in Mexico is just terrible. Violence is horrible. Weapons trades and the drugs trades going across the borders is just horrible. The impact on security is just really unthinkable. And it's more than policies. I think it's about human beings. And also, again, personal responsibility. Like, what are we doing? What is the impact that we have, in our personal choices?
Yeah, I think about this term security, and actually at the Center for Women's Global Leadership a few years ago, we tried to do a survey to try to get women to answer that question: what does security mean to you? And we did it in a few regions, and it was very interesting to see how each region, it was different what that meant. And so we did a survey at a meeting in Asia, in Southeast Asia. And what we got from there was security was land ownership, because there was so much land grabbing, and women weren't able to, as farmers, have secure land so that they could grow food and eat. Whereas we had another one that we did in the Middle East and North Africa. It was a regional meeting, and there it was personal security, physical security, partly because of the militarization and war and all these other things. And so, when the word security comes up in terms of presidential candidates, you really do have this image of guns, right? And it isn't that. It's about food. It's about health care.
It's about streetlights.
It's about streetlights.
Can you walk down the street safely at night, or are you going to
and climate change. I mean, we're having the hottest
clean water, which we talked
clean
about.
water.
How much is your water?
Yeah, that
poison.
you can't drink a glass of water is a very insecure place to be.
It's about being able to use public bathrooms.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought that was a very interesting juxtaposition on the question of whose security are we talking about. North Carolina and a slew of other states in the U.S. are passing these so-called bathroom bills.
Yeah.
In North Carolina.
There are more important issues.
Exactly, claiming that they want to keep people safe in public bathrooms, when in fact they have not one documented incident of a transgender person. So the issue is that they're trying to force people to use bathrooms of their original
sex.
Yes, yeah. Gender identity, sex identity, no matter what they identify as. And so because in North Carolina, Charlotte passed a law that would allow everyone to use bathrooms of the gender that they identify with. So they've banned this use of bathrooms of a gender you don't obviously or not perceived to identify with, based on the idea of security. But there's not one example of any transgender person attacking or harming anyone in the bathroom. It's actually the reverse.
Of course.
Over 50% of transgender people who've been surveyed will tell you that they've been at least harassed, if not physically violated. In some schools, it's up to 80%. So it's that question.
You know, in South Africa, just after the apartheid, when they shifted to democracy, there was an attempt again by the security industry to, sell helicopters and submarines and so forth. And there were women in parliament who basically said, "Wait a second, we need to let's go out." And they did a national defense review, which was going out into communities and saying, "What does security mean for you?" And based on those results, they came back and they actually developed a national security policy that was really framed around human security. And it talked about poverty, and it talked about HIV/AIDS, and it talked about having an army that was not an aggressor but was trained to do peacekeeping. So it was a big shift. It talked about the police being there to be trained to serve the community, not to be aggressive. Now, of course, the defense and security industry pushed back, and now there's things are not quite as. And the aspirations haven't really been met. But I sometimes think, imagine if we did that in this country. Imagine if we went out and said, how insecure, for me, is the bridge going to fall? Think about it, like all the infrastructure issues. My kids are walking around in Washington going to school. How many times do we have to worry about shooters and lone shooters and crazy shooters and this and that before we do something about basic gun control in all of these public spaces?
I was going to say we actually have more people who are harmed by guns in the United States than outside quote unquote terrorists or people who would do us harm. But we failed to pass any meaningful gun control. So, again, it begs that question of whose security are we talking about? And I think the way it's played out in the U.S. is that we're often trying to protect people against the outsider or the perceived other. Meanwhile, we have a lot of work to do in making sure that we are a secure community. And like you were saying, if I think about things that matter to me, I'm thinking about being able to walk the streets safely. I'm thinking about my economic security and my security in retirement and things like that. So about human security as it's put. So I think we need to broaden and force the candidates to broaden that conversation around security.
Absolutely, and I think it's not only about physical security, but security as a nation and as a world, right? I mean, what is it that we need to do in order to have economic policies that actually are in the service of people's livelihood rather than the 1%? We have such high levels of inequality, which we talked about, and the people who are in power actually have captured our government. And so I think security means getting rid of Citizens United and McCutcheon versus the FEC. Those are two things that are very dear to my heart, and I think security means that we take back control of the government. And so in the last few minutes that we have left, I wondered if each of you had one last thing that you wanted to say, that there's a burning issue that you wanted the candidates to be able to speak about as we go to run up to the elections. And Andrea, I'll start with you.
For me, it's very important to make connections, connect the issues. It's like issues are not isolated. When we talk about an issue going on in Mexico, in Nigeria, somewhere else, there's always a connection to our way of life here that we're protecting. So just make those connections. Like, things don't happen in isolation. The immigration has to do with policies. So just make those connections.
Ejim?
I would love for them to do something as simple as abolish the death penalty and talk about that.
I would like them to consider the concept of freedom of expression as not only just a right that we all have, but a responsibility that we all have. And therefore, those of us who are expressing these issues and raising these concerns, whether it's national or domestic, foreign policy or security policies, should be listened to, because it's about wanting to engage constructively and make life better for everybody. Whereas I think we're in a space right now where many of the issues that we raise, whether it's domestically or on international issues, the space is certainly abroad. It's becoming much more constricted. Civil society space is getting lessened, but even here, people often worry, oh, if I say this and I criticize this candidate, if this person gets into the White House tomorrow, does that mean that my organization or my group will be shut out from the conversations? And so people censor a bit. And I think that's the worst thing we could be doing. We need to have very open conversations. And so take freedom of expression as the responsibility of citizens and listen to them. And I think, in the Democratic Party, at least some parts of it, we're seeing a little bit of this, but it would be great to have much more instead of them talking at us, actually much more listening to different, town halls in different sectors and so forth.
Yeah, and I think and I agree with all of you on that. And I'd say the other thing that I would personally like is really for them to reevaluate what this economy is for. I mean, I know I'm a little economistic, that's partly my training, but it's really frustrating to see how badly the entire world is doing right now. And the predictions for growth are decreasing by the minute. And so we're going to actually be in more trouble very soon. And so if we're not moving into this next year with really rethinking economic policy and hoping that we can come up with a new evaluative framework for why we do this economy, we're in trouble. So let's hope that the candidates listen to us and that we end up having someone listen and get them to think about things differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you.